Hello and greetings. I'm Shani Peer. I'm the director of the Columbia Maison Française, and I'd like to welcome all of you for joining us today for this event with Mohamad Amer Meziane talking about his book, Des Empires sous la terre, Is There a Secularocene? We are very pleased to be presenting this along with the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life and the Institute of African Studies. We're sorry that we can't be joining together in person, but very happy to have Mohamad with us and to have three distinguished panelists, Souleymane Bachir Diagne, Etienne Balibar, and Anne Talal. They'll be introduced properly in a moment by Emmanuelle Saada, who's my colleague and friend, professor of history and French at Columbia, who will be introducing and moderating this event. I wanted to let you know that the event, we are keeping a live transcript of this event. So if you want to watch the live, follow the live transcript, you can do so. And we will also be saving that for future reference. The discussion is also being recorded and will be put on our website afterwards. So you are also free to submit a question at any point in French or English using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And we'll save some time for questions at the end of the hour. Thank you so much again for joining us. Thank you to Mohamad and to our distinguished panelists.
Thank you very much, Shani and the Maison Française for organizing this event. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome here in this space Mohamad Amer Meziane, who has been at Columbia for a few years now and who has already made his mark on our campus and in our collective reflections. So the way it's going to work is that Mohamad is going to introduce his book in a few minutes. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to actually find my notes and switching screens because my notes were on the screen, no longer here. Sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So Mohamad is going to introduce his book in a few minutes, and then we'll have three distinguished panelists to respond. And then Mohamad will have the opportunity to respond to the response, to respond to the comments, and then we'll open it for the Q&A. So as Shani said, you can write your questions in the Q&A, and I will report them to Mohamad and the other panelists. Mohamad Amer Meziane is a philosopher. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the University's Paris 1, Sorbonne in Paris, and he's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Columbia, both at the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public, and the Institute of African Studies. He's been an influential, important member of the editorial board of the Journal Multitude in Paris. Today he's here to speak, obviously, about his first book, Des Empires sous la terre, Histoire écologique et raciale de la colonisation, which was published by the edition La Découverte in 2021. As the title kind of indicates, the book brings an extremely important, I think, reflection, brings together the history of the European project of secularization, the process of racial capitalism, and the exploitation of the environment, and crucially, of fossil energy under the earth, sous la terre. So after a short presentation by Mohamad of a few key points of his book, we will have three distinguished respondents. I won't have the time to introduce them in detail right now, and actually they don't need it. Let me say that they have in common to have deeply informed in the past 30 years the ways in which we think about colonialism and imperialism, and how something like imperiality has shaped our ways of being in the world, our concepts, and our manners of articulating them, and also how this imperiality has deeply informed our political present and futures. First to intervene today will be Anne-Laura Stoller, who is the Willy Brandt Distinguished Professor of Anthropology and Historical Studies at the New School for Social Research. the founding director of the Institute for Critical Social Inquiry, and the founding co-editor of Political Concepts, a critical lexicon. Her many deeply influential books include, and I'm quoting here just a few, Duress, Imperial Durabilities in Our Times in 2016. Recently, Thinking with Balibar, co-edited with Jacques Lezra and Status Gregouris in 2020, Along the Archival Grain, Epistemic Anxieties and Colonial Common Sense in 2009. And she has a new book titled Interior Frontiers, Essays in the Entrails of Inequality, which is forthcoming from Oxford this spring. After Anne, my dear colleague, Souleymane Bachir Diagne, will intervene. Bachir is a philosopher. He teaches in the departments of French and philosophy at Columbia, which he joined after teaching at the Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar for many years, and at Northwestern University. His research, his fields of research include history of logic, history of philosophy, philosophy in Islam, and African philosophy and literature. He is also the author of many books. Let me just mention The Ink of Scholars, Reflections on Philosophy in Africa, which was published in 2016. Bergson, Postcolonial, L'élan vital dans la pensée de Senghor et de Mohamad Iqbal, which was translated as Postcolonial Bergson in 2019. In Search of Africa's Universalism and Decolonial Thought, which is a dialogue with the anthropologist Jean-Loup Amsel, was translated into English in 2020. And finally, the very recent Le Fagot de ma mémoire, de Saint-Louis à New York, itinéraire d'un philosophe musulman, which was published in 2021. And last but not least, today we'll have a comment, a response by Etienne Balibar, who is also a philosopher specializing in epistemology, political theory, and philosophical anthropology. Etienne has taught in many universities all over the world, and to name a few, the University of Algiers, Paris, both the Nanterre University and La Sorbonne, and most recently, Columbia University. He is the author or co-author of a myriad of books you all have heard of, and maybe even read. Reading Capital with Louis Althusser in 1965, Race, Nation, Class, Ambiguous Identities, which was published in 1991 and co-written with Emmanuelle Saada. Violence and Civility was published by Convention Press in 2015. Citizen Subject, Foundations for Philosophical Anthropology, and very recently, 2 volumes of collected writings called Écrit 1 and Écrit 1 et Écrit 2, which were published by les Éditions de la Découverte in 2020. Okay, so Mohamad, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Emmanuelle, and thank you all of you, and for being here. I just want to say, before I talk about the book, that precisely this book is the result of a multiplicity of dialogues, and some of these dialogues have involved scholars who are here. So I would like to thank everyone, because probably I wouldn't have been able to write this book without your help, your support. So yeah, so I'll start with an obvious fact, which is that this book, as the subtitle indicates, deploys a racial and ecological history of secularization. For this reason, it is not a critique of secularism as a political doctrine. It is rather a philosophical history of a multiplicity of processes, and this multiplicity is precisely described as secularization. So what I want to do is to outline the 3 main arguments of this book. First argument, secularization is both imperial and colonial. In other words, there is a dialectic between imperiality and colonialism, and this historical dialectic engenders secularizing effects. In this book, The paradigmatic illustration of what I call the imperiality of secularization is the Napoleonic imperial state. Hence, the history of secularization begins not in France, not in Europe, but in Egypt during the Napoleonic expedition to Egypt, and it continues in Algeria for reasons I will explain in a minute. France, in other words, should thus be seen as a margin of a wider history which overlaps with the history of Orientalism. Secondly, Orientalism has invented a discourse which racializes Muslims in a specific way. This discourse is, of course, more than a discourse, so to speak, because it has been systematically implemented through colonialism, but more precisely through an apartheid state in North Africa. This apartheid state is what was called, during the 19th century and afterwards, French Algeria. Thirdly, the racial trajectory of secularization is only one dimension, and it is linked to an ecological dimension. So in other words, what we call race on the one hand and ecology on the other hand, are or can be seen as bifurcations of a secular order. The secularization of empire, therefore, cannot be fully understood without describing the transformation of capitalism into a fossil economy. This interdependence between race and climate change is a manifestation, in my view, of the interdependence between empire and capital. It is therefore impossible to analyze the mythology of secularization without understanding what happened under our feet and in the air we breathe when this myth was enunciated, when a few imperialists and industrialists said, we are going to make heaven real in this world. I'll stop here because we don't have much time, and I'm happy to start the conversation. So thank you very much.
Well, that was very, very rapid and beautiful. And thank you, Mohamad. I fear that mine is longer. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to join this lustrous panel with two of those here who have long been in conversation with Mohamad, and which some of us have already had the pleasure of hearing in different fora about the book. I've indeed been one of those who have read Mohamad's book before it was in a découverte, and reread it once it was published by La Découverte, and fragments again and again. One might think, having worked on and in the racial and intimate borderlands of imperial formation so long, I'd be well positioned to be succinct and use these 10 minutes judiciously, pose my accumulation of queries without any pause. But alas, it's hard to do that. Not altogether my fault, I must say. I would contend, for it is much a function of the rich and unique qualities of Mohamad's treatise, how he approaches his subject and the reader with both a style of writing and a style of thinking that defamiliarizes readers with what they thought they knew, revamps political concepts, again, that we thought we knew, tilting our respective fulcrums, rendering one almost unsteady, and in ways one would not have thought to go. It's not merely that imperial states and secularism and Islam configure differently. It is that the very understanding of what secularism is and what is done in the world is totally transformed in Mohamad's hands. His work that moves between history and philosophy and concept work is not so much seamless as radically adisciplinary, rushing quickly where others have barely tread. In its French version, it is in a decidedly French mode. I say that with a smile. Footnotes tend to be more spare. Think Foucault's almost total absence of them. But with relief, as Tony Grafton too would applaud, they are not peppered with historiographic flourish, though more local history could be there. Nor are they authorizing gestures, but paths through his conceptual and philosophical alliances. But really, why start there? Because I think one piece of Mohammed's strategy, and this is what I'm talking about, not the arguments he makes, much as how he makes them, right? But really why start there? Because I think one piece of Mohammed's strategy of thinking and demonstration might be too easily missed. Those footnotes are genealogical in the deep sense that I think Foucault too intended. Mohammed too underscores, ferrets out multiple possibilities, and all of them realized or taken. I call it developing historical narratives. Historical paths and analyses arrested and suspended. Everything doesn't come through. Everything is not realized, rather than that usually taken, pointing to the importance of failures, rather than the unwavering glory of secularism, imperiality, Islam, or Napoleon, ever expanding and expansive. There are no linear paths here, sometimes so few, the reader might even have appreciated various maps of recursions, subsoil resources alienated from church land, as we know, and subsoil much later in the form of extractions in Algeria, right? We know about both quite well. Fossils, states fanning out, secularism in recursive proliferation, even when Napoleon reinstalls power in France upon his return to Egypt. But what it offers is not a Foucauldian genealogy. For a signature of his work is how deftly he scrambles what we think we know. For contra Foucault, there is only a partially originary story here. Napoleon initiates imperiality in the way Mohammed describes. Secularism as at the strategic heart of Napoleon's project. Secularism opens the underground dates to the fossil state by usurping church lands and appropriating them for extraction. Adherents to Islam are not to be shunned, as we know, in Napoleon's global imaginary, or degraded, but embraced in a secularism that in Mohammed's hands no longer looks like the secularisms as we might know it from learned text or even from Wikipedia versions. And the fossil state, as it comes to be called, is at the heart of imperiality and overtime and overload. The resources, the funds that allow roads, bridges to crisscross French Empire through colonial Indochine, the ironclad sugar mills in 19th century Java, hauled from France to produce a world market when Haitian sugar production was squashed, where steam machine coal production was later become paramount to the English textile industry. But the causal arrows are emphatically clear in his account. Somewhat surprisingly, X causes Y, A causes B. The act of colonization gave rebirth to Islam, I quote unquote. Islamists are not to be converted, but subsumed. Some would later, as he says, call it a policy of association rather than the violence of assimilation. Both were violent in many ways. But the analyst does something different with origins, where he argues this is the moment, or it, whatever it may be. But the difference is that there are many. It doesn't come down to one ever. These it's, these moments, as Mohamad Amer said, for the diversity and the dispersion, as Foucault would say, of origins. There's no teleology about what path one, and almost no inevitability to where secularism or Islam would go. I hope I'm not over. Well, almost not. For it is secularization in Mohammed's hands that allows for imperiality and Napoleon's push for a new secularism, but do both secure the fossil state? We know some parts of the story well from his careful description of the usurpation of church lands. But origins return sometimes again, for there's an ordinary moment of imperiality and secularism as a political project, as I understand. He takes us through almost a surreal narrative. The ordinary declaration, but we might ask whether it's really the establishment of power that Napoleon and Mohammed professed, or is it partially a false performance, but more so a failed performative? We know that he says it's not a ruse because that's what everyone else thought it was, right? that only performs but fails to enact. That the clown-like but dead serious strategic chameleon king Napoleon dons Islamic garb, some say converted to Islam, and that his hosts were so appreciative of his Islam that they gave him the honorific Ali Bonaparte as his name at the time of a festive occasion, and that supposedly in something close to delirium, he repeated as his real name in 1834 when confined decades later to St. Helena. With declarative confidence, Mohammed insists that this was the real moment when a strategy of secularism, later called ethnicity, and imperiality was really born. He rejects the common historical narrative that this was Napoleon's strategic ruse, though he agrees that it is part of Napoleon's visionary of global power, that he will take the place of Alexander the Great. But this is only one piece of Mohammed's extraordinary thinking and writing, because the reader is thrown asunder, one's footing unsteady, the signposts repositioned or heading in unfamiliar directions. The ill ease, at least on my part, and I would not assume this is the case for many others schooled in the history of Egypt and secularism in Islam, derives intentionally on Mohammed's part. It's his whole style of writing this story, to not allow the reader to fall back on how various concepts have been used, because he's arguing they are dead ends that they impose. He is forthright with his direction and declares that he is developing and working towards a new grammar. And that is the grammar that's so important. But something else emerges at this point in the story. And then again, we no longer know what hegemony really looks like. What to do with Ali Napoleon, imperiality's protagonist king, who literally disappears from Egypt far before the excavations of Algerian minerals in 1834. The initiative of a mining industry that will speak across Europe and the world, from coal to steam, to sweeping tides and the pursuit of underground mineral resources as the engine and material source of industrial capitalism. We can't help but be reminded of the late Fernando Coronil's Magical State, where he argues for a much later period how much it was not just possession of the land that produced the ephemeral wealth in Venezuelan state, but excavation and possession of the subsoil minerals, the ground underneath the trees and crops, the depths of the earth on which state power is based. But Coronil doesn't get nearly as far as does Mohammed. Coronil's critical analysis centered on the exponential growth of Venezuela oil industry in the 20th century, its imagined road to becoming a fantastically modern nation, until all of this fails. He did not have the chance to live, to witness the devastation of emptied banks, lines of the hungry, the fleeing of wealth. But he too got the story, not with the historical depth of Mohammed, but as the savior of state power, dependent on extractions of oil, a fossil state that turned its population toward food riots, enragé by this elite siphoning off of an absconding of enormous wealth. We might, as a minor question, if there's time, ask about the historical relationship between imperiality, extraction, and the fossil state. And this sounds unbelievably naive, perhaps, but wasn't the Inca and the Aztec Empire built too on the extraction of the subsoil of silver and gold and tin and copper, right? We know this in much earlier dates. Or is it the conjuncture, the timing that really Mohammed's after, the matrix of colliding and converging forces that different from those earlier abstractions? Or is it simply that they did not provide the actual fuel that made things run? This is not only a bold historical analysis, one that takes the reader to many places analytically and geopolitically where one might have thought to go. And it is not only the extraordinary movement of the book that leaves one breathless. Can I catch up? Did I get those connectivities right? Are they all there? But there is something unique, uncommon, as those of us and most of us are not good storytellers, right? Schooled storytellers, almost define the tame of conventional historical accounts, never snide, but critical and playing with us and playing with form. There seem to be 4 protagonists in his account, each of which, as Mohamad presents them, are familiar and wholly different from what we think we know. They are obviously secularism, they are imperiality, they're Islamic, and not least that figure fantasy, ever quintessential scholar, militant master of the world, only in his dreams, Napoleon. Each have ambiguous qualities, all of them protagonists, different locations of work and appearance. At one moment, significant here, nothing stays the same, nor do they invest in the same pursuits or achieve or fail at them, the same practices and intentions. None of the protagonists are self-contained. Each are protean, even porous, nor assign fixed attributes with definitive limits. Each wander, roam across geopolitics and across the globe. And the Napoleon adapts their comportments, countenance, and the cloth of their cloaks and clothes. I think I'm too long. I have another page, so should I allow, should I end here? Master of ceremonies, Emmanuelle.
Go ahead, but no more than 1 page. After that, I could.
That's it. Okay, each of these protagonists are unstable and quixotic. Each have given familiar and unfamiliar attributes that can't help and are intended, I think, to unsettle the rapid reader. Skimming is impossible in this book. You lose time if you try to. You miss the sometimes subtle transitions, but even the reasoning you would lose of these transitions and definitions, even if they're repeated many times, because you sometimes get the definitions of imperiality, though not really why it's more effective and opposed to the narrow scope of either coloniality or imperial formations. You will undoubtedly miss why those definitions matter and why they do so. So in deference to my two colleagues, Etienne Balibar and Bachir, who know Mohamad's work better, his thinking and the terrain of his interventions far better than I decide here to take this alternative path, addressing his style of thought, the style of his exposition and writing. For reading Meziane, Mohamad is an extraordinary experience, in part because of his counterintuitive propositions, stop one short, demand a slow reading, for those propositions really do cascade on almost every page. I mean, I think that's really one of the problems. Not a problem for him, but for us. This is not to say they're treated lightly. On the contrary, he is meticulous in making his claim. I'm going to cut to the end here. Okay. To something I wanted to say about the Napoleonic civil code and why it's so absent in the book. Okay. And I say, as some of us again, if there was time, would insist on a direct and harsher confrontation with Napoleon's civil code of 1805, where the alleged equalizing a woman, because it's been held, produced some of the most serious legal sources of denigration, dependency, and dispossession for women, the indigenous lovers of colonial white men who had to relinquish any of their legal or common responsibility. And where chercher la paternité and the demand for child support were forbidden for those Javanese women who had lived as the servants, lovers, mothers of the child they bore. It was indeed Napoleon's civil code that ensured imperiality. One of its defining features as a fossil state depended on forced and unfree labor. So how many of us more senior and aged on this particular panel would even have enough to say 5 years after our PhDs were defended, probably by now more than 30 presentations by Mohamad, 20 publications, I'm not sure I'd have enough to say. But these are a sign of something else, not only the vast interest and intrigue his work produces, but the multiplex nature of it. Only 3 more lines. Its opening, its breadth, its welcome audacity for succeeding so well. In prying a portal, he has initially and intentionally left entreouvert, that is ajar, to what comes after and to our own dark present and future. So thank you, Mohamad, for offering this invitation. I'm sorry it took so long.
Thank you. I come next, I believe. So I wanted to start by saying how much I have enjoyed our conversations, Mohamad, how much I have enjoyed having you these past couple of years or 3 years here at Columbia as a colleague and as an interlocutor. And I've enjoyed the conversation we have had around philosophy, history of philosophy, Islamic philosophy, post-colonialism, and all the different topics that you explore so beautifully in your book. And I'm also very happy to share this panel with colleagues and friends and to have this conversation around your book, which I would just characterize by one word, by saying that it is an important book. I could characterize it as beautiful, beautifully written, and has done that in a wonderful way. And I believe it is important, and I will borrow also a word from Anne when she, the word revamp. And the importance of your book is the way in which it revamps truly the concept of secularization that you have defined in a very particular, precise, and very enlightening way in des empires sous la terre, histoire écologique et raciale de la sécularisation. You show that everything started with the expedition of Napoleon in Egypt. So, and when Napoleon started speaking some pseudo-Muslim language, in a way that could be, that could make us think about Lawrence of Arabia much later, at a much later time, and even about the movie Dune, which is now playing, as you know, in select places. And we know that Frank Herbert, who wrote the science fiction book out of which Dune was translated into a movie, was himself an admirer of Lawrence Arabia. So I close that parenthesis. So what you show very well that started with this expedition of Napoleon in Egypt is that particular concept of secularization that you invite us to explore with you in your book. The invention of indigena, what is going to be in colonial, in French colonial system and doctrine, indigena. What you call very well the theological, political racialization of Muslims, and then also what you call the codification of Islamic law, showing in connection with the theological, political racialization of Muslims, the way in which Muslims were assigned to a codified religious practice by colonialism. And this is very well done in your book, and that is what, for me, makes it so important. So the premises started in Egypt, end of the 18th century, first year of the 19th century. And then you mentioned that what started in Egypt was fully realized in the Algerian laboratory. And Algeria is a very paradigmatic case in your book. You mentioned the French Empire, but in a way, the French Empire is very often narrowed down to North Africa, and North Africa itself narrowed down to Algeria. Algeria is really at the center of your reflection. And I see here an aspect of the fact that you are thinking with Hegel. This book of yours, as we know, as you explained, is somehow half of your dissertation, which was a dissertation on Hegel's philosophy of history, and in particular, philosophy of colonial history. And so even though that aspect is not present in this part of your dissertation that became a book, Hegel, you are still in conversation with Hegel. And I could see in this importance of Algeria, the paradigmatic nature of the colonization of Algeria, what Hegel said in his lectures on the history of philosophy that he gave in Berlin in the early 19th century, when he was in particular recreating his own notion of Africa. As you know, in those lectures, Hegel decided to just divide Africa into different parts. He took out of the African continent Egypt, because Egypt was such a brilliant ancient civilization that for him, this could not belong to the African continent. So Egypt, here goes Egypt with Asia. And then North Africa, as you know, separated from the rest of the continent by the Sahara. The belief that the Sahara was a wall separating two worlds was really very present in Hegel's geographic mind here. And then south of Sahara for Hegel is what he called Africa proper. So just the lands of lions and obscurity, and, you know, as he said, that was the true Africa, Africa proper, just in the dark mantle of the night of the spirit, to quote here Hegel. And this is the reason why, and what he saw, as you know well, in North Africa was a way of prolonging Europe. North Africa, the destiny of North Africa for Hegel in his lectures on the history of philosophy, on the philosophy of history, sorry, was to say that it was the destination of North Africa to prolong Europe, because North Africa was part of Mare Nostrum, the Mediterranean Sea, which was supposed to be the crucible of the cradle of civilization. But it could only be a way of prolonging Europe through colonialism. No equality at all. It had to prolong Europe through colonization. And as you know, he saluted during his lectures, while he was giving his lectures in 1930, he saluted the conquest of Algiers as being the premises of this destiny that he envisioned. I believe you have followed him in making Algeria so central. So my question, my comment and my question would be this. I would like to hear you about another way of displacing, of decentralizing the Algerian paradigm for this idea that everything that started in Egypt was realized in Algeria, and from there spread in the French Empire, in Asia, and in the rest of the African continent. Let me take now the case, for example, of that you know well, because you have continued that kind of discussion with our good friend Mamadou Diouf as well. Let's take the case of Senegal and the so-called four communes of Senegal. As you know, in 1848, the Second Republic in France decided that the cities of Saint-Louis, Dakar, Gorée, and Rufisque will be what was called in French commune de plein exercice, meaning that the inhabitants of those four cities in Senegal would be French citizens. The question being, they are also, the majority of them, Muslims. Well, qu'à cela ne tienne, as we say in French, they will retain their status as Muslim, their personal status as Muslim, be citizens, and the rest of the population will be indigene. I'm mentioning this because it brings in two different things. Depending on the different regimes in France, Code de l'Indigénat itself and this process, this true process of secularization, changed a little bit. In other words, it is not coincidental that it was the Second Republic that decided that after the revolution of 1848. It was not coincidental that at that same time, there was a seat, a parliamentary seat for inhabitants of those 4 communes, which was taken back by Napoleon III and the Second Empire. First his regime of presidency, and then the Second Empire. And it was reestablished by the Commune. So depending on what kind of regime you had in France, the whole process that you have described very well worked differently if you look at it from other territories from the empire, not just Algeria, but also Senegal. So when you mention the creation, the foundation of indigena and the racializations of Muslim in 1870 in Algeria, putting this in conversation with what happened before in 1848, not in Algeria, but in Senegal, would kind of not make different your conclusions, but complicate them and enrich them, I believe. Probably when the second book, more centered on Hegel, comes, you will have a chance to look at that aspect of things. I do believe that there is, your book as it is, wonderful as it is pointing towards what I would call this absent book, the conceptual book of your discussion, of your conversation with Hegel's philosophy, or I'd rather call it the livre à venir, the book to come. And I really hope that this is coming next, following this wonderful work of yours. I hope I saved us a few minutes. By the way, Algeria is losing the football game against Côte d'Ivoire. I'm sorry about that.
Is this right now? Is this happening right now?
It is happening now.
For the competition. Okay, thank you so much.
It's happening now.
Bashir,
Bashir, never predict the end of a football game before it's finished.
True.
That's wise. That's wise. You're all right.
Is that we're going to have to go beyond 1 o'clock because it's already 12:46, and so.
So you give me 10 minutes?
I do give you absolutely 10 minutes. Not much.
Okay, so I take my 10 minutes. No more, Emmanuelle. Okay. So thank you so much. I, of course, want to repeat everything that's been said already by my friends and colleagues, how grateful we are for the invitation, how delighted we are, and I, particularly from Paris, no longer able to come to the Maison Française in person. So this is a kind of little compensation, and I'm very, very happy with that. Okay, so I believe I will, much has been said by my 2 colleagues. I will, in a sense, quite naturally follow up on what Bashir said about the importance of Algeria. But before that, allow me a few general considerations. First, of course, I agree. I mean, this is an important book. This is an extremely important book. This is a very, very powerful book. This is a very original book. This is an incredibly erudite book. This is a book with a guiding thread, I mean, a philosophical idea, the looming question, of course, of how to handle the philosophy of history on these bases and so on. It's a provocative book, and it's from my point of view, I said that already to Mohammed. We had several discussions about that. He knows my point of view, but he also perceives my progressive adaptation to his to his orientation. It's an extremely disputable book. I mean, I take it in the etymological sense of the term. I mean, almost every thesis, so to speak, in this book, to me at least, is problematic. But it's, so I'm not convinced. But I'm delighted not to be convinced, because I see that there is work to be done, that there are problems to be discussed among us and many others for quite a bit of time. And of course, as a consequence, some of us will reverse our initial point of view. I'm ready to that, and essentially will learn enormously from the discussion. Now, let me add one quick consideration to regarding the question of the reception. This is also something about which I wonder. This book does not belong to French theory. I always hated that name, but in this particular case, I think that it is really moving us away from the stereotypes about French theory. But it's about French colony. Or the French way of colonizing, and the general importance, the universal meaning, not of the French way of colonizing as such, because of course, and I'll return to this in a minute on a specific example, when you move from the French Empire to the others, the Spanish, the British, you face, you confront, of course, great differences. But what the book demonstrates, I believe, is the interest and the importance for the understanding of colonization and imperiality, I return to that, of granting, without any chauvinism or whatever, the French case a central importance, and highlighting something that perhaps is more visible in the French case than in any other, which, let's put it right now, has to do with the specific articulation of the question of religion and the question of race that I find of the highest interest. Now, another question that derived from there, and I sincerely wonder about that, is how is that book going to be translated, particularly translated into English? Of course, I very much hope that this will be the case, and perhaps you already have offers or plans. I don't know, your publisher has been contacted, and I'm sure that I'm convinced that this should be done. But the problems of translation will be huge. And of course, they touch, and they will be fascinating. And they touch notions and categories which we always knew already, in some cases, are untranslatables in the specific sense that the Dictionary of Untranslatables has given to that. This is eminently the case with secularism, secularization, laicity, and so on. But I tend to believe that this could be also the case with imperiality, because we're all now already using imperiality as a kind of equivalent. I'm not sure that imperiality is good English. I'm not sure that imperiality is a notion that would be natural in English. I asked the question, because many concepts or categories which in French, German is also a different case, are framed or made like that with the termination it. In English, as I perceive it, are rather something hood, So it's and I don't believe that empirehood could exist in English. I'm sure it can't. But the question, of course, is entirely linked to the extraordinary idea that is at the center of Mohamad's book, namely the idea that the imperial dimension, of modern colonial nations, such as France, eminently, of course. And this is all the more striking because France is a republic. Therefore, this could not work like that for Britain, for example. And in the principle, the United States don't have the kind of colonies, they come later, they have a few, but they had a few, but the kind of colonies that France or Britain or Spain had. So the imperial dimension of this anti-imperial regime, that is officially the absolute opposite of empire, namely the republic, is an extremely strange combination of suppression and continuation, for which and even reenactment, because the French, of course, were imbued with Roman models, etc. Marx said that already. So this is what Mohammed describes as spectral, as the spectrality, another eti of the articulation with empire. And of course, okay, so I was perhaps too long on that. If I still have just how many? A few, 2 minutes, 3 minutes? Emmanuelle, should
Yeah, you have 3 minutes. Meanwhile, I would like to remind the audience that they can ask questions in the Q&A while you speak.
Okay. So I come to my point. Too late, perhaps. Which is race and religion. What I find, of course, extremely interesting and central, and Bashir already alluded to that, and as well, central is the book, is the detailed, precise history and analysis of the way in which the French colonizers made Islam a racial category and therefore also as a consequence stigma. And this is full of paradoxes. I spent some time in Algeria when I was young for reasons which I don't, which are clear, etc. And one of the things that struck me immediately, and that is one of the aspects of the unbelievable violence of this colony, like all colonies, but is the form in which in Algeria, and this is different from Tunisia, this is different from Morocco, perhaps the western part of Algeria is a little, is somewhat of an exception. The symbols, the visible signs, the buildings, the artistic forms that typically belong to the Islamic tradition have been systematically erased by the French colonizers. You barely see mosques in Algeria. I mean, there are two great beautiful mosques in Algeria, but that's otherwise. So this is the huge paradox. On the one side, the indigenous people are racialized as Muslims. And on the other side, the French colony destroys Islam as systematically as possible as a culture and as a discourse. Now, the fact that that Islam as such becomes the instrument of racialization leads to incredible oxymoric formulas. For example, you at one point in Mohammed's book, you turn a page and I must have known that, but I had forgotten it. There were indigenous people, natives, if you like, in Algeria, of either Arabic or Berber descent, supposing that these are two different lines, which is also problematic, who converted to Christianity at one point or another. How were they called? Christian Muslims. Can you believe that? And at this point, you turn to the points of comparison that he very interestingly discusses. For example, of course, the great comparison between French Algeria and British India. It's not the same size, etc. On the other side, of course, such a formula would be nonsense in India. I wonder, I'm asking the question, if such an absurd formula as Christian Hindus would exist in India, but I don't believe so. Now, finishing on that, this is a problem of the greatest, utmost political importance today, because there is this enormous debate and violent conflict, especially in France, about the issue of the articulation of Islamophobia and racism. This is, again, our listeners know it or don't know it, but the category Islamophobia is practically officially banned in France. And in any case, it's been recently again attempted by the French administration to ban the use of that category from teaching in universities and using in other places. Why? Because under the use of this category, they understand something like Islamophobia is a virulent form of racism. It's perhaps the main form in which, not the only, but the main form in which racial stigmatization is taking place in France. Now, in Mohammed books, in a sense, we have the deep colonial genealogy of that phenomenon, except that a reversal has taken place. Today, Islamophobia, which is widespread everywhere in the world, is directly racialized in a country like France. But in the past that Mohammed is studying, it was the other phenomenon that took place. The use of a certain way of categorizing, legalizing, codifying religion, assigning Islamic law a direct function in the organization of the empire, that generated a certain form of racism. And of course, this is very important because there are different ways of racializing people. They all, in a sense, belong to the general framework of the colonial process, although not entirely, of course. In Europe, you had processes of racialization of Jews, etc., which had nothing to do with the colony. But in the US, already you have several. The one that is in the first, that is most visible, of course, is the terrible and great process of racialization that is based on color and that derives from the history of slavery. The process that Mohammed is studying, whose genealogy is studying, using the French case, not because it is unique, but because it makes certain things particularly visible, is another genealogy. And I believe that politically, it's very important to have this diversity in mind in the political debates of today. Sorry, I was very, very long.
Thank you, Etienne. Thank you very much. I'm sure Mohammed is very grateful to the three of you for your comments and remarks. So, Mohammed, you have like a few minutes if you want to say one or two things to each of the panelists. Sorry about that. And then I will take questions from the Q&A. Please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, not in the chat. It's I can't be looking at both, and I will bring them to Mohammed. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuelle, and thank you, all of you, Anne, Bashir, and Etienne, for your comments. I'm going to try and be short, which is very difficult. The first thing is both as a response to Bashir and Anne. I wanted to maybe make it clear that I think about chronologies, decisions about, you know, where to start, where the analysis of some processes begin. I take it for granted that this is, you know, that there are multiple options, so to speak. And I think maybe it's not clear enough in this book to the extent that, you know, there are books behind books, as it was said, but this history is written from a particular place, which is also a margin to in my view, it's a margin of a margin, but that's another problem. And this margin is described as North African. So it's a North African perspective, one of the possible North African perspectives on a global question. So if I was to describe, you know, the place or the site from which I'm trying to think, I would think of this site as a point of view on a totality, and there are as many points of views of, I mean, as many histories of a totality or a global process as there are different points of view. So this is the first thing I want to say. Same thing about the fact that the French Empire seems to have a central role, and I want to insist on the fact that there is a comparative work being done in the book, even though other empires are mentioned afterwards. So basically in chapter 4, 5, and 6. So no doubt, for example, the British imperial model of, you know, United Kingdoms, as well as the German model of the Reich, are also illustrations of the imperiality of secularization. So they could be, for example, alternative points of departure of the same history, and therefore they could, you know, be other possible or engender other possible beginnings, other possible chronologies, and other possible comparisons. So this is why this book, of course, is not stable. And in fact, a book is not really a stable object, but is a fragment. And in this case is also a stratification, that is to say, an accumulation of mutable strata, so to speak. So the second thing I want to say has to do with the fact that indeed there is an explicit conversation with Hegel and Hegelianism for you know, different reasons. But the first one is that I do think that the space, if I may put it that way, of what we call contemporary continental philosophy, but also, for that matter, what has been also called French theory, is haunted by the specter of you know, Hegelianism, more or less. And so, to some extent, I'm trying to be explicit about that and to make this confrontation direct and explicit, and to think from that point of view, which is, of course, once again, a point of departure which is not absolute. That is to say, we could start from somewhere else. I want to mention the fact that I don't think I'm following the geographies of Hegelianism as far as you know, the construction of you know, the divide between Asia, for example, and Africa is concerned, and the internal divide between two Africas is concerned. Or if I do, then it means that Fanon also follows Hegel, because I'm also trying to follow and to make sense of the ways in which what has been called the Algerian Revolution has made us think about space differently, so to speak. I'm going to mention the fact that the discussion, one of the discussions I've been having about these questions with both Emmanuelle Saada, but also Mamadou Diouf and also Mahmoud Mamdani, has actually engendered an essay which has been published in the Misr Review, so the review of the Makerere Institute of Social Research, in which I'm trying to make these points a bit more explicit. So I suppose I have to stop here, because that would lead me to say, you know, too many things. So thank you again for your comments, and I hope I'll have other occasions to answer differently. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's in a way it invites to a spectral series of conversations. So let's open in different kind of directions. There are several questions already. I'm going to try to group them at this point there are three, but I'm going to group them by, through themes. One, the first question is I think really important, really interesting. It's about your connection, which actually is obvious in the book, to other people who've been working to the current reflection on the global regimes of fossil power, right? So Andreas Malm, Amitav Ghosh, Malcolm Ferdinand. You discuss at least two of them in your book at length. I don't remember Amitav Ghosh, but is this a story about France and Islam and the Secularisation, or is this a story that doesn't have to necessarily include France and Islam, right? For me, it's fascinating to listen to this panel and see Etienne not mentioning at all the question of what you call the Secularocene, right? So the book can be read without that in a way, or it makes a contribution at least on its own without that issue. So could you address this, your connections to these other authors?
Well, yes, thank you, Emmanuelle, for this question.
It's not mine, it's Ben Beitler's question.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yes. Well, the dialogue with Malm, because I think his book on fossil capital is extremely important to the extent that it describes the conditions under which capital has become fossilized, so to speak, or has become a fossil economy. So I'm trying to discuss this genealogy by bringing some of the concepts I construct by analyzing the French case. So this is the gesture. And in my view, what is problematic, or what doesn't appear in the analysis, is at least two things. The first thing is the central role that the state plays in the ways in which the capitalism is being transformed, and the second aspect is precisely the ways in which, for the same reason, secularization should be seen as part of the conditions under which not only capital is being accumulated, but fossil capital is being accumulated. So this is one of the central arguments I'm making now. As far as the question of Islam, or what now we call Islamophobia, is concerned, I must say this is one of the reasons why I decided to write the book as it is that of course there has been very interesting work on the relations between race and climate change, but I don't think that enough work has been done more specifically about the connections between Islamophobia and climate change. I mean, there are a few authors, including someone who hasn't been mentioned, who's Ghassan Haj. Because I am who I am, I'm thinking from the point of view, which is, the point of view in which I am, or I inhabit, so to speak. So this is why I try to insist on that. Now, I do think that there are connections. It's quite clear to me between what I'm trying to call an apartheid in North Africa, which is premised upon the institutional racialization of Islam as such, as it has been also redescribed by Etienne, and the kind of economy which has been deployed during Algeria during the 19th century, of course, and in order to be really accurate about that, one should mention the deployment of a capitalist agriculture, in fact, in this context. But also, and this is something I want to work more on, is precisely the ways in which what has failed, so to speak, around the 1870s, so to speak, at the end of what we call the military colonization of Algeria, how actually what has failed at that time has been reactivated, in fact, after 1962, so to speak, the century after, which goes back to what Anne was describing at the beginning of this conversation. That is to say that so-called origins are, first of all, never absolute, but they come back, so to speak, precisely because part of what they were trying to do, or part of what's, some actors in history were trying to do, precisely because it's failing, it might come back in a different way, right? And I think that what has been done in Algeria after 1962 in terms of extraction could be analyzed from this point of view, from a longer perspective. So this is the kind of questions I'm trying to ask and the kind of genealogies I'm trying to write. Of course, this book is a first book, so it's supposed to, or at least in my mind, it's a way of opening questions, and questions I'm trying to clarify, and I hope I'll have time to clarify them in the future.
So actually, thank you. In this genealogy, there was one question about the role of the Saint-Simonien in Algeria, and in basically the production of Islam as race, and also the kind of racial capitalism in a way that was. I mean, I'm expanding on the question. It was not exactly put in this way, but what is the role of the Saint-Simonien in Algeria?
Well, I think it's a central role, to the extent that it's, as we know, because it has been shown notably by different historians, French historians, but also someone like Abi Merched, for example, in English, have shown that the Saint-Simonians should be seen, probably, Saint-Simonianism should be seen as the central industrial ideology of France, let's say. Namely, it means that when we speak about the industrialization of a country such as France, it means that we're referring to, of course, a series of processes, but we're also referring to an ideology which was not just a discourse, because these actors, the Saint-Simonians, precisely were actors in the sense that they have had an impact on the ways in which a country like France has been industrialized. Now, as far as Algeria is concerned, the Second Empire, the official counselor or advisor of Napoleon III was himself a Saint-Simonian. His name was Ismail Urbain. And it's quite clear from what we know now that the Saint-Simonian movement has had a crucial influence. Now, what I'm trying to show in the book is that the institution of what we call indigénat, to some extent it is untranslatable, but it's the status of what it means to be a colonized subject and a native, if one might use this word, is something that precisely some Saint-Simonians have influence. An institution that they have been implementing, so to speak, because they have participated in the debates and so on and so forth. But I want to say that the indigénat, from this point of view, is really linked to the ways in which Islam was codified in this particular context. So I don't mean to say that the Saint-Simonian doctrine did engender the institution of the indigénat, but it's more or less the different connections and the different debates between them and the military power in Algeria, which have engendered many of the institutions that have been central, such as the indigénat. This is not exactly clear. It's a long, it's a big topic, but this is what I could say for now.
Thank you. So I see that Etienne, you have your hand up to ask a question. There are two.
May I? No, it's not a question. It's just a very, very, very quick remark on this issue of Saint-Simonianism. We were not going to start a seminar on that. Mohamad and I already had a little discussion about that. I completely agree with the idea that this question of the historic and ideological function or role of Saint-Simonians is a decisive issue. And I have to say that not being an expert, but having spent a good part of my life reading these texts and their use, I find the chapter in which Mohamad provides a description of their role an absolutely extraordinary chapter. This being said, my personal position, if I dare say so, hypothesis, is that, and you go in that direction in your last remark, is that we should not think in terms of cause-effect. Cause, the Saint-Simonian doctrine, effect, the colonization, the invention of indigena. Why? Because Saint-Simonianism is a highly systematic discourse, but it's also a discourse which almost immediately, like Hegelianism itself, produces a bifurcation, or people from there go into opposite direction. So what is important, is interesting, is this the schism, the scission. So just one word on that. What derives from Saint-Simonism are the French modern banking system, the industrialism, the Canal de Suez, the indigena, as Mohamad has just explained. All this, in a sense, is part of a single movement which belongs to the heydays of capitalism. But on the other hand, Marx, 20% of the sentences in the Communist Manifesto are direct transcriptions of formulas that come from the Exposition de la Doctrine Saint-Simonienne. And the founding figures of French feminism, including those who took part in the Commune and then were exiled to Nouvelle-Calédonie, are Saint-Simonian activists. So I stop there. I'm not denying any thing that Mohamad says. I just say there is a deep and fascinating conflict within Saint-Simonianism itself.
Thank you. I want to bring two other questions that were in that are in the chat. One is about, and which are in a way invite to the question of comparison and invites to a form of situation of the French case in a larger genealogy, maybe, or a larger set of genealogies in the plural. One is a question about which was addressed in the Q&A to Etienne Balibar, but actually it is addressed to Mohamad. In the sense that Omar Ben Slimane was saying that he doesn't agree with the idea of the racialization or your thesis on the racialization and Islam. And the disagreement was expressed with a reference to Malcolm X and his views of the white man and the concept of race. So I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but I think the that there are other ways actually of thinking about racialization and Islam, and the Malcolm X or the Islam in America might be another way. And then there was another question completely different, but I'm trying to group them together, about Turkey and Turkey today and Turkey's secularism story. And in what sense could you? I mean, after all, Turkey is also the heir of an important empire in the region, right? And so, how do you think about that specific story?
Difficult questions. I'm not exactly sure I completely understand the first one, but I'm going to start by the second one and maybe say a few things about the first one. Turkey, yes, well, the first thing I can say is that I'm really trying to think against what should be maybe called epistemic nationalism. That is to say, the idea according to which we could analyze different cases as separate from each other, because from what I know of what is called sometimes secularism, even in in Europe, the different discourses and ideologies, and therefore the sources of what we call sometimes, for example, French secularism, come from Germany, Britain, if not elsewhere, and therefore there is a mutual, influence circulation of these ideas, and to some extent, at some point, you could see that it becomes sort of different nationalized or different national traditions, but it's always a late process and to some extent a superficial process. Now, as far as Turkey is concerned, I could say two things, and of course I can't, answer by saying yes, I have an explanation about what happens in Turkey. But first of all, the so-called decline of the Ottoman Empire since the end of the 18th century is certainly part and probably a geopolitical condition of the kind of processes I'm trying to analyze. In other words, we have been, talking about France, maybe too much, but many of the discourses on secularization, which are, written in French, of course, could not have existed if for example, the Ottoman Empire had won the war against Russia, let's say at the end of the 18th century. I'm thinking about a text which is written by someone called Volney, who was a source of the expedition to Egypt, for example. And in fact, one of the reasons why I started thinking about the so-called imperiality of secularization was precisely because in one of his texts, he says that the site in which secularization should be, or secularism for that matter, should be implemented is not in fact France, but is Istanbul, once the Ottoman Empire will collapse, which was quite striking to me, because I saw that precisely these different histories are intertwined. Now, of course, the influence of some European models of secularism on Turkish intellectuals, it has been documented. So I can't really say more than that, but it's certainly a direction of possible future research. So thank you for this question. Now, yes, I don't think that the racialization of Muslims and Islam functions in the same way everywhere in the world. That would be problematic to say that. What I'm trying to say is that some of the institutions of race, some of the ways in which there was an institutional racialization of Muslims and therefore of Islam in Algeria, in the specific country, I'm trying to see how some of these institutions have been disseminated, used against, of course, transformed in other places, because what I think is that 1830 is a very early moment in the history of colonialism, in the sense that what we call the Middle East today, or the Arab world, doesn't exist as such at that time, because it's part of the Ottoman Empire, right? So what I'm trying to say is that, for example, because we are in an Anglophone context, there has been a tendency to think, okay, the expedition to Egypt is the beginning of the history of Orientalism, and then if you want to study the next step, then you stay in Egypt, and then you study what happens in the Middle East, and so on and so forth, which actually completely obscures the fact that something is happening long before the Middle East becomes the Middle East in North Africa, right? Of course, I'm using these categories because we use them conventionally, right? And of course, they should be problematized, because the distinction between them is not something stable. But this is the direction the orientation of the research, right?
Thank you so much. There aren't other questions, so maybe we should stop here. And thank you very much, Mohamad, for your book, for your important book, and thank you to Etienne and Anne and Bashir for their comments. Of course, there are other books behind this book, but this book in itself, I think, has already given us a lot of things, including this great conversation. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to you, but also to the audience and the people who've taken the time to write questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emmanuelle.